So thank you for that introduction. That's very kind. It's very nice to be here and to have the opportunity to speak to this audience on this very important topic. So yes, I'm the director of ChemAlive. We're a Lausanne-based digital chemistry company, really, and software developer, as mentioned. We really want to hit the goal of doing chemistry in silico for all of the chemical industry. And our company is really based around that principle, and to develop tools that allow experimental chemists to use more data-driven methods. So let me just first give you some background about me. Next slide, please. As mentioned, that was very nice for the bio. It was quite detailed. I'm a New Yorker. My accent has been washed away for the most part. But after New York University, I was at UCLA doing theoretical chemistry. I then moved to ETH to do my postdoc with Francois Diederik doing experimental chemistry. So I'm really a mix of a theorist and an experimental chemist. So I understand both worlds and able to navigate both and interact with both. Then after that, professor or lecturer, assistant professor in England, and then back and forth between Lausanne and England because of some two-body problems we had in our family. So eventually settling in Switzerland to just found ChemAlive and to try to make an impact in the industry that way. Okay, next slide, please. Right, so the chemical industry spends somewhere between $250 and $350 billion a year doing research and development. And basically that work amounts to trying to connect chemical structure on the right here to performance. What does the molecule do? And most of this research, unfortunately, is done through trial and error because chemistry is a very complex science. It's very hard to actually connect structure to performance for a variety of reasons. One way to mitigate the long lead times to find new innovative solutions in chemistry is to use digital research. A number of reports in the last 2 decades have come out and predicted that 50% of research will be digital by X date. We haven't seemed to arrive at that date. It keeps getting pushed back by a decade, but hopefully some of our work and the work of others will get us there. So that's our goal, to do more chemistry in the computer before we enter the lab, to save money, to save time, and to actually innovate and to be able to share our innovations more readily through digital conduits. Please, next slide. Right, and I think if you're paying attention to technology and chemistry, you're hearing a lot of things about AI and machine learning. Of course, we do some of that as well, in addition to computation. One of the things that we try to do to help that process along is to try to stay away from using experimental data to drive machine learning algorithms. It's very hard to actually to get enough experimental data on a particular challenge to get a critical mass of data to learn anything from it. And often the data, the availability of data is what acts as a blocking issue for doing more advanced analytics. So what we try to do is use advanced and accurate computation to supplant or fill in the kinds of experimental data that isn't available for a particular challenge. Next slide, please. The technology we use is quantum chemistry, and I have to point out, because there's a lot of buzz these days around quantum computing, that this often causes a confusion. We are not a quantum computing company. We're not doing quantum computing yet. We're quantum chemistry, which is really the application of quantum theory to chemicals. So most of computational prediction these days still is using what's called classical physics, which is on the left, which essentially is the same mathematics as that which we use to define the force constant of a spring. The quantum theory is much more complicated. I'm using a particular version of the Schrödinger equation here to make it look more complicated than it is. But we use this much more modern physics to get at properties of molecules that classical physics is unable to do. So this is where quantum chemistry sits. It's a much more accurate, much wider scope method. The only downside, of course, is that applying these methods takes a lot more computational power and computational time to get a solution. Next slide, please. So back to the topic at hand, our software and our contract research organization delivers quantum chemistry. It delivers it in a configuration which is cloud-based and fully automated. So we're able to scale calculations of the quantum variety on the thousands of molecule scale directly from very simple chemical descriptors like SMILES or XYZ coordinates. So we're able to automate these kinds of calculations and very quickly distribute them on the cloud on a large scale that's almost commensurate with what's expected these days in terms of more classical methods, especially in the bio and pharmaceutical industry. And finally, we also take the data we extract from these calculations and properly curate it into our own database that's really fit to purpose for doing advanced analytics and machine learning and other kinds of things. Next slide, please. And just an overview of sort of the value we deliver to experimentalists, right? So experimenting is all about correlating parameters, and often we have a problem in experimental research where we have some data about a particular challenge, but we're missing a lot of data, or we have some data points that are unreliable, collected by someone else 50 years ago, just simply missing, etc. What we can do effectively is fill in all this missing information and also validate the information you have to make a complete correlation diagram. So we have a full sort of experimental set. And we do this in three main areas. One is in structural chemistry, which has very important influence on drug discovery and pharmaceuticals. So we predict molecular structure much more accurately than classical physics can. Construct is a software which is basically in beta, pretty much finished and deployed in a demo. React and Spectra are softwares we're currently developing further. React is a software for predicting reaction efficacy, reaction times, reaction yields. And Spectra is for predicting advanced molecular properties like color and redox properties. So these are the three areas the verticals, if you will, that we try to explore and try to bring in contracts with and develop software in to help experiments in these areas. Next slide, please. I wouldn't call myself a climate advocate, but I have become one. There are two very important, trends in chemistry. One of them is sustainability. The other one is digitization, and they happen to correlate and overlap quite heavily. Without trying, we've had a number of projects which have a direct sustainability impact, and I'm putting them here in order of increasing impact. So we've worked on projects in the plastic industry, which could, in principle, if everyone were doing this kind of predictions, it might impact 4.6 million tons of CO2 equivalents per year. We've also had sustained contracts in the oil and gas industry, which impacts 100 megatons. R&D efficiency, reaction optimization, manufacturing, 220 million tons, and also one project in the developing pharmaceuticals for cows, which had the highest impact. So all totaled, the work we're doing, if the whole world were doing our work on every chemical reaction, every chemical process, we'd be impacting about a little over 10% of the annual global GHG emissions. So this is really important stuff and really impactful. And we've helped to develop some of these things working with the Climate Kick European network and an accelerator as well. So next slide, please. I'm going to go through some of these projects we've done very shortly. So just a reminder, there's quite a lot of money spent on R&D. This is somehow the breakdown of the revenue in chemistry. What might not be known is there's an estimate that $50 billion per year is wasted on inefficient manufacturing. So that's a fifth of the entire R&D budget. Imagine what we could do in R&D and chemistry if we could get back this $50 billion and actually apply it to innovation rather than just throwing it down the drain, which is literally what's happening. There are two ways which manufacturing and process chemistry are made inefficient, which I'll talk about on the next slide in more detail. But one of them is in temperature. We actually worked with the Climate Kick Accelerator to do this little thought experiment where we thought, if we could affect 1% of all the chemical reactions that are conducted in water, and increase their rate through catalysis, which is something we also work on in terms of quantum chemistry, by 100-fold. That would mean roughly a 60-degree decrease in the temperature of running those processes. If we could do that, that would actually produce or save enough energy to power 2.5 million homes in the U.S. So these kinds of small changes can have a very important impact on sustainability goals. Okay, now next slide, please. So there are two ways to help processes, and we'll focus mostly on chemical reactions and processes here. But one is really atom economy. So can we make reactions more efficient so that they produce only one product and there's no purification afterwards and so on. So we've had a number of projects in that area, which I'll discuss in more detail. And the other one was what I just mentioned, which is temperature and solvents, et cetera. How can we better design molecules and better design the processes so that they consume less energy and so on. So those I'll talk about. There's 6 use cases that I'll go through in a high level. Next slide, please. So here's one use case, and I understand some of the audience is trained in chemistry. Perhaps many of you are not. So I'll try to keep this at a high level, but I have put a lot of details in here for chemists who can look at it later as well. Here's a case where we looked at the reaction optimization of a reaction which was producing a pharmaceutical that is consumed by cows. I can't share the structure for most of these use cases, but this is a well-known pharmaceutical. You can look it up. Cows which live near the seashore eat seaweed, and this chemical is in seaweed, and it helps to reduce the amount of burps they produce, which is a huge amount of methane, which is emitted into the atmosphere. And this process was designed to produce this drug, but the problem is the desired product is in the middle here, and a secondary product is downstream from it. And the idea is how do we design a reaction to stop in the middle? And this diagram, if it's not familiar, is an energy diagram. The axis here is energy. Where we go up in energy that requires heating, and down in energy releases heat. And these curved pieces are the barriers that sort of act as pinch points for the reaction. So there we identify in our modeling transition states and barriers, and also energetic states in between. And what we found here in these arrows is actually the effect of polarity of the solvent on these various barriers and states. And higher polarity is up and lower polarity is down. And the conclusion here, which we were able to track on this graph on the side, was that if we increase the high polarity lowers the barrier to the secondary product, so that's bad, and high polarity also lowers this energy. So if we actually reduce the polarity of the solvent, we were able to show that we could get this desired product and while minimizing the secondary product, which would vastly improve the process and lower its impact quite a lot. So that was a nice outcome. Next slide, please. Here's a similar case where there's a reaction which produces, which is supposed to be protected. But the protecting strategy produces 2 products. One is a desired product, the other is a major product, and that's a problem. We're able to show through various computations in high throughput that by scanning different protecting groups that could be used, that there's a nitrogen, that particular protecting groups would actually give us 2 effects. One would be to increase the barrier of the reaction that goes to the wrong product, and actually to decrease its exothermicity at the same time. So we were able to show that we could find a pathway to the desired product, which is faster and more efficient. Next slide, please. Similar situation here. We were designing a pyrazole-based drug, and we had a high-throughput method for producing the transition state energies. These are the barriers going over the reaction barrier, and to cyclize this heterocycle. I'm not getting into too many details here, but if you look, we're able to show quite a variability between 12 and 8 kcal per mole. And if you think about those numbers in terms of transition state theory, if you change the transition state energy from 12 to 8, that's definitely more than 100-fold increase in reaction rate. It's over thousands, 10,000. So we're able to predict how to design reactions that go much more efficiently. And the faster a reaction goes, generally, the more high yielding it is, because there's less time for other things to happen that you don't want. So these are very important outcomes for our clients. Next slide, please. Here's a case where we're moving away from reactivity and more towards molecular properties. We're predicting here the color of a large data set of dyes for a client. The client patented a particular reaction. I'm not showing the exact chromophores here. These are redacted to some degree, but they had a big patent of covered a lot of molecules, and they wanted to know which of these would be red. They only wanted red dyes for biological staining application. So they gave us about 500 lead molecules. We were able to use our software to predict the color. So the border is the predicted color, and inside is the picture of the crystals of a particular data set they gave us. So of 500 molecules, we were able to scale our software 3,000 core, produce these quantum chemical calculations. There's some errors in orange, so the blue are in our successful calculations. And we were able to predict the color quite accurately, and then also do some post-processing to deliver an RGB space value. And this was essentially took a 500 compound list and made it and prioritized it along the colors. So we said, okay, instead of producing 500 molecules, you only need to produce the top 20, which are going to be red. Of course, that saves them a huge amount of effort if you consider that each molecule probably costs on average about 3,000 euro to produce, outsourcing wise. Next slide, please. We also have an ongoing collaboration with Saudi Aramco, where they're interested in producing gel and other materials for actually repairing oil wells. In one case, they had a gel material, which if you added aluminum metal to it, it became a liquid, which is quite interesting outcome. And we produced a paper with them in the Journal of American Chemical Society, and also showed that exactly why this aluminum was changing the phase nature of this gel through detailed computation. And that allows them to design materials that directly affect a large emission actually source. Closed, broken, and unused oil wells have a huge impact on climate. Next slide, please. Finally, there's a application in plastics where our client is in the recycling of plastics industry, and they have a problem, which is when you have a limit to how many times you can recycle a bottle, because every time you take old bottles, you introduce new contaminants. And one particular contaminant was a problem. They needed to be below 1 ppm. That's this red line. We're able to show through modeling the reactions that lead to that contaminant that at different temperatures using rate modeling effects, that we could tell them exactly how many minutes they can run their process at exactly what temperature to keep the amount of that contaminant below a certain value. So obviously, in a plant configuration, you can't change the chemistry too easily. You can turn a few knobs like temperature and pressure and reaction time. So it's important to let those clients know exactly the effects of turning those knobs. Okay, I think that's the last use case study. Next slide, please. So this is a closing slide. We help our clients find solutions to greener chemistry, really, and to more efficient manufacturing, processing, and also R&D through advanced quantum chemistry, which is automated. We do this in a contract configuration as well as a software one. So I'm happy to take any questions and to talk about those use cases in more detail. Thank you for listening.
So thank you very much for this very interesting talk on your technology and approaches. I will start this time with some questions from the audience directly, because they are nearly the same like I had partly. So the question for us is, where do you see the highest impact of your technology? Is it in which kind of industry, chemical industry or pharmaceutical industry, do you see the biggest advantages in this case?
Well, the pharmaceutical industry is particular. Almost all of our contracts have been in the performance industry. Not to say we won't work with pharma, we of course will. But in the performance industry, there seems to be much more competition to produce better processes. So I think, and of course, if you look at the amount of material produced in the performance industry versus the pharmaceutical industry, we're talking a big difference, right? Every time you paint your house, that's a performance chemical. So the impact is really going to be in the manufacturing and process area in performance and fine chemicals.
Okay, so how does ChemAlive model green chemistry directly, meaning chemistry carried out in water?
Yeah, so we haven't done a software in this area yet, but we've had a number of requests and some early stage projects proposals where what's very important in green chemistry is solubility in water versus other solvents. And also there's phase transfer catalysts type work as well. We are able to use quantum chemistry to train and improve classical mechanics simulations and multi-scale simulations to allow the very accurate prediction of solubility. So if you need to move your process into water, we can very quickly tell you whether those molecules will solubilize in water versus another solvent, and how to modify them to get them to be soluble. So I think this is an area which will be very important coming up.
Okay, one question from my side. From our institute, we are often working in research projects, AU projects, where we have to tackle low TRL projects. And then normally we have to do some kind of hotspot analysis in LCA or in economics. Do you see options to use your technology to, or your approach to optimize these kinds of assessments?
So in terms of how much will one process cost and what the impact will be versus another in terms of production of materials and so on. Yeah, not now, but certainly in the future, we would like to integrate these kinds of assessments, especially also in terms of fine chemical and materials tracking for synthesis. So looking at ways to choose the best materials to start with at the lowest cost, and also alternatives in terms of making like green chemistry assessments. So one thing you could imagine doing is automatically getting a good value of the solubilization of a product versus another, like a catalyst, and then saying, okay, this might cost more, but it will be more greener. So you can make your assessment like that. This is something we would like to do. One of the things we need to do that is a greater critical mass in terms of use of our software. So we're really just starting to scale out our software and would like to interact with academics in terms of a freemium model so that we can collect data. That's really important for doing that.
Okay, concerning limits, the next question on the audience: which are the performance dimensions that you can stimulate? For example, for biodegradability, heat stability, specific reactivity to a given functional group, or solubility?
So we can do all of those things. The only limitation, I would say, is this molecular size. So we need to keep things, unfortunately, to a small molecule, medium molecule size, so under 500 atoms. So that's the first limitation in terms of quantum chemistry. But in terms of reactivity, we can and have assessed lability of certain bonds, for example. So the lability of molecules in biological context or in abiotic context. So any reactivity problem on a molecule that's approachable by quantum chemistry can be done, with the caveat that if there's a real need, for example, in biodegradable plastics, for example, which is an area of interest for us, we can, of course, train with quantum chemistry force field approaches that allow us to then get accurate assessments of reactivity on large molecules. This is a very complex process, so I would say to do that is really a research-based project. There's a lot of research involved, but it's something we're configured, of course, to do. So we do research projects as well as direct projects that come out of our software. So.
Okay, and then another question concerning carbon footprint. How does the carbon footprinting generated by high-performance computing compare to that using quantum computing? What's the energy barrier to switch to quantum computing?
I don't know if there's any metrics on quantum computing yet for that, because quantum computing isn't really a commercial product. There are a few quantum computers in the world that do some things. But they're really not being used at a level that you could compare to AWS, for example. Now, with that said, AWS, using that, I think I'm going to make up a number. It's going to be somewhat ballpark correct because I don't remember exact number, but it's something like 80% or 70% the carbon footprint of a cluster that you would be using personally. So there's already a benefit for using cloud computing versus own hardware. I don't know the answer for the quantum computing. I don't know if anyone knows that answer. It's an interesting thing to look up.